مساء الخير. أنا اسمي سامر عطلة، أنا أستاذ مشارك بقسم الاقتصاد بالجامعة الأمريكية بالقاهرة، ورئيس وحدة الأبحاث بمشروع حلول السياسات البديلة. برحب بيكم في لقاء النهاردة. أولا اللقاء هيكون باللغة الإنجليزية، اللي يحب يكون يستخدم الترجمة الفورية في الخارج الزملاء معهم السماعات دي للترجمة الفورية. دي أول نقطة تنظيمية. النقطة التنظيمية الثانية، أرجو من الحضور بعد إذنكم إغلاق الهواتف المحمولة حتى لا تتسبب في إزعاج أثناء اللقاء. Good evening, everyone. My name is Samer Atallah. I'm an associate professor of economics at the American University in Cairo. I'm the head of research at Alternative Policy Solution, a research project in the American University in Cairo. We are a non-partisan research project that aims at producing evidence-based policy solutions that tackle social justice and economic justice. We have been working for the past couple of years in producing a policy paper on taxation, natural resource management, education, and renewable energy. This week marks the International Day for Poverty on the 17th of October. This has been a day that has been celebrated by the United Nations for the past since 1992, and we have decided to dedicate our events during the month of October for issues related to poverty and impoverishment. Last week we had a panel discussion conducted by two of the prominent Egyptian economists, Professor Ali Al-Mahdi and Professor Hiba Al-Laythi, who discussed the latest round of the household income and expenditure surveys that indicated the increase of poverty in Egypt in the past 5 years. And we really appreciate your attendance in this event last week. We also really appreciate your interaction on the social media, on our Facebook page and on YouTube and Twitter. We have actually uploaded the video of the whole panel on our YouTube channel. Those of you who came in, they have a pamphlet. In this pamphlet you see the social media platforms that you use. I strongly encourage you actually to subscribe to our newsletter, to like our Facebook page, and to follow our YouTube videos. All our events are immediately posted on our social media platforms. We also encourage you to interact with us, to present your ideas. We had a considerable and big interaction on the social media with our campaign that asked the question, why are we poor? And this really an important question that we are very prone on discussing and presenting to the general public. We believe that being poor is not a choice, it's a reflection of policies that cause this impoverishment and the lack of opportunities to access basic services such as education, health, and infrastructure, and to access jobs that are respectful and equitable. I'm very pleased today to welcome one of our guest speakers who came all the way from Colombia the country, and he has done a lot of work on the impact of austerity policies on impoverishment. I'm very pleased to welcome Sergio Chaparro, who works as a program officer in economic and social policy at the Center of Economic and Social Rights. He's an economist. He has a master's in law, and he used to be a former consultant for the Colombian Parliament. With that, I'm very pleased to give the floor to him to talk. His talk will be for 40 minutes, and then we'll have 50 minutes or up to an hour for questions and answers, where you can ask him questions about his talk today. Without further ado, I would like to welcome you again. Thank you for coming in this turbulent weather in Cairo. And with the Cairo traffic, I really appreciate your presence. And I want to thank Sergio for coming again all the way from Colombia to come. And I would like to give him the floor to start his talk. Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you very much. Well, مساء الخير. Shukran. This is all I'm going to say in Arabic. Now I'm turning to English. But first of all, I want to thank Alternative Policy Solutions for these invitations. I'm really thrilled and honored to be here in Cairo to share some reflections with you. As a researcher from Latin America, and particularly from Colombia, I find a lot of issues in common to discuss with you. And as I will show in my presentation, and hope you get convinced at the end with this idea, we face similar challenges, and these spaces are very important to come up with potential solutions for those challenges. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I want to thank you all for your presence here. And I really hope you leave this room at the end thinking it was worth to attend this lecture. I would like to start with a couple of pictures on what's happening in the world today. And let me start with this heading from 2 weeks ago in Ecuador. During the first 10 days of October, thousands of Ecuadorians took to the streets demanding an end to an internationally monetary fund imposed austerity package that eliminated fuel subsidies and mandated public sector wage cuts. And after the tragic deaths of 8 indigenous people who were the main group, was the main group protesting in the streets, and with at least 1,000 people injured, the government eventually agreed to repeal the decree, which raised fuel prices, but austerity package will continue to be implemented in the country. However, victims of austerity do not live only in the developing world. This is a picture of Janet Beltran, a Nicaraguan born undocumented woman in Spain who died after waiting for 4 hours to be attended at a hospital. She lost access to public health care as a consequence of a royal decree law issued by the Spanish government in 2012 in the context of implementation of a broader package of austerity measures in the country. These 2 cases show that austerity and the way governments answer to social unrest created by it might have fatal consequences on people's lives. You might have seen in the news over the last week that social unrest with austerity is spreading out to different parts of the world. As this heading of the New York Times says, from Chile to Lebanon, there is a wave of popular backlash against austerity, and it has exploded suddenly to claim for alternatives, for alternative solutions, alternative policies. So the purpose of this talk is to explain why assessing the human impacts of economic policies and of austerity in particular is indispensable to advance towards better policies and prevent unnecessary human suffering. To do so, I will present a practical tool developed by the Center for Economic and Social Rights, the organization that I work with, to conduct assessments of how fiscal policy impact on human rights. My my presentation is divided into 4 sections. So in the first section, I'm going to talk about the definition of austerity, what we are understanding by austerity measures. Then I'm going to move towards explaining why a human rights or an assessment of how fiscal policy impact on people's lives is needed and is important given the current context that several countries are facing. And then I'm going to explain a little bit how to conduct this kind of analysis and what are the methodological challenges that researchers might face in order to conduct these assessments. Finally, I would like to finalize with the question of what's the aim, what's the purpose of conducting this kind of analysis. So I hope to move from the what to the why and then to the how to conclude with the what for in my presentation. And if there are some questions at the end about any of the details, because I will have time only for presenting the general picture, I will be very happy to discuss that at the end with all of you. So let's start with explaining what do we mean when we talk about austerity. So austerity is austerity or adjustment measures or fiscal consolidation measures, as some people refer to, can be defined as legal or policy changes which aim to lower public expenditure and tame growing sovereign debt burdens. The nature and mix of fiscal consolidation policies vary from one country to another. However, I'm going to focus on 4 kinds of measures that are the most common measures included in austerity packages, which are public expenditure cuts, regressive tax changes, labor market reforms, and pension reforms. So my first idea is that austerity can be understood as a set of political measures that has turned into the standard prescription for economics in stormy times after the global financial crisis in 2008. So in this chart, we can see the number of countries contracting public expenditure or projected to contract public expenditure between 2008 and 2024. So, as you can see, after a first period of fiscal expansion to address the economic crisis during 2008 and 2009, G20 countries decide to change the focus to address the economic situations that the world was facing. So after 2010, we have had 3 main shocks of a fiscal contraction in the world. As you can see in this chart, the first shock happened between 2010 and 2011, and where more than 100 countries in the world contract public expenditure to answer to the crisis they were facing after a first round of expansion. So why this happened? Because there was a big concern agreed among G20 countries about the levels of debt and the fiscal deficits in the world that was fed by economic research saying that high levels of debt are correlated with lower growth rates in the long term. This research has been very controversial, has been contested by several researchers, but it became a paradigm for designing policies that intended to reduce the level of debt and reduce the size of public deficits. So after the first shock, there was a period of softer adjustment implemented by a lower number of countries. But then between 2016 and 2017, there was a second shock where, again, more than 100 countries decided to contract public expenditures. I would like to focus in the third shock. So the third shock is projected to happen between 2019 and 2021. Will affect the larger number of countries among this period. This is data, this is based on IMF data, on projections that IMF does for a big group of economies. So during this period, the IMF forecasts that 69 governments might be slashing their budgets excessively, and 19 of these countries are expected to be spending more than 5.0% of GDP less on average in comparison to expenditure levels during the pre-crisis period. This is before 2008. Before 28. And most of these countries, or a higher percentage of countries, will be doing this adjustment in the North Africa region. So this shows that for several countries, in terms of the capacity to increase the possibility to raise public expenditures, this has been a lost decade. So the possibility to strengthen their fiscal position and to increase public expenditure as a way to fulfill human rights has been seriously damaged during this decade. Let's see what does this mean in terms of the size of the global population affected. Projections indicate that austerity will affect approximately 5.8 billion persons by 2021. This means 70% of the global population. So this chart shows that what will be the population affected by public expenditure contraction during this period. And as you can see, more than 70% of global population will be living under conditions of fiscal austerity by 2021. In terms of regions, this graph shows that for 2020 onwards, the Middle East and North Africa has the highest proportion of countries contracting expenditure during the three shocks. So 15 out of 20 countries on average will be doing this, which is also the region that undergoes the most severe cuts, around 3.2% of GDP on average. For country income groups, 45% of countries classified as low income will experience budget cuts during the three shocks. So even when austerity has impacted on both developed and developing countries, the heavier burden rests on developing countries. And this chart shows the number of countries that will be implementing one of the following austerity measures: pension reforms, wage bill cuts caps, labor flexibilization reforms, and the others you can see in the chart. As you see, several countries will be implementing more than one or two of these measures, and those countries are mostly developing countries. All this information is based on a very good report that recently came out, that was published by Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings, based only on IMF data, and has been very influential to show like my basic thesis in this first part of the talk, which is that austerity has become the new normal in the world. So austerity is not only a set of policies, but has become a new ideological paradigm. And what this paradigm is about. It's an attempt to restart the engines of growth by slashing public investment in social goods and social protections, chopping away at what remains of the commons. The thing is that this narrative is still framed as the only alternatives that countries have. But what I would like to explore in the next sections of my talk is if this is really the case. And I want to clarify that examining this issue and defending alternatives to this paradigm doesn't mean that one is not concerned about fiscal responsibility. Actually, fiscal responsibility and human rights concerns are similar to the extent that both are think to try to avoid the damage and negative impacts on people's lives. So it is possible to defend a fiscally responsible vision without defending these measures as the only alternative response to trigger economic growth and to achieve full employment. And that will be like the main focus of the next sections. So it's very likely that in the debates about these issues, those who defend alternative policies will have to face some fallacies or some common myths about austerity. We have identified here 8 of those myths and human rights responses to those myths. So in addition to make those impacts on people's lives visible of austerity, as we have seen before, a human rights approach might be useful to challenge the myths that plague mainstream debates to justify that there are no alternatives to austerity. And I just want to include one example of this. So one of the myths is that governments cause the crisis through excessive public spending. However, there are several causes that might be behind an increasing public deficit. It doesn't need to be an excessive public spending, but it can be a lack of revenue. It can be, for example, the regulation of financial markets, and other causes that usually are not addressed under this classic diagnosis. So before getting to this diagnosis, it is important to do a more careful assessment of what are those causes. Why this is important? Because if we do not conduct the right assessment of what are the causes of the crisis, we might come with solutions or with policy options that might exacerbate the problems that we are trying to solve. So, for example, if the deficit is not a deficit that entail a non-responsible fiscal trajectory in a country, and that deficit is cut, that might have several impacts not only on people's lives, but also on the economy itself. Because it might slash the possibility to recover an economy that is going through stormy times. So it is very important to come up with the right diagnosis, not only to protect human rights, but also from an economic perspective. And it is very important to address some of these fallacies or myths, taking into account that it's not only a question of normative considerations vis-a-vis economic considerations, but that both approaches might be complementary. So let's move to the second question. Why a human rights impact assessment of austerity? Why we propose this methodology to analyze from a different perspective these policies. Because these assessments can help recenter human rights as the ultimate objective of economic policies, even in times of fiscal stress. So we have identified that austerity has cumulative and compounding effects on people's lives. So, for example, expenditure cuts might reduce the quality of education, might reduce access to that education or to other social rights such as health, might reduce access to other key public services like, for example, childcare. And if you add regressive tax hikes to expenditure cuts, this might reduce disposable income, and if in addition you have labor reforms, this might entail reduction on wage income and an increase of working hours. So these measures do not come alone. They have cumulative impacts that are important to understand and to assess, to see if the adjustment proposed really takes seriously like the capacity of the society as a whole to absorb that impact. This has to do with a discussion that is becoming more and more important at global level, and is that economic policy and fiscal policy in particular is a human rights issue. So I just compiled a couple of quotes from different professors and special rapporteurs from the United Nations that show that these policies are addressed from a different paradigm according to what these actors are saying. So, for example, Philippe Austin, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, has said that appropriate redistributive measures through taxation and other fiscal policies must be seen as an integral part of a commitment to ensuring full respect for human rights across the entire society. And other actors have increasingly recognized that resources are as important for human rights fulfillment or for complying with constitutional commitments as laws. That without resources, we won't have rights. There is no possibility to seriously fulfill human rights. Why is this? Because there are 4 ways in which fiscal policy can contribute to the fulfillment of human rights. The first way is that fiscal policy defines the extent of resources available for funding social policies, and in that way for resourcing rights. The second way is that fiscal policy defines the extent of redistribution that a society wants to achieve. The third way is that fiscal policies create incentives or disincentives to encourage actions that are more aligned or not with human rights. For example, tobacco taxes as a way to protect the right to health. So this is a third way in which discussions of fiscal policies are relevant to the aim of protecting human rights. And finally, fiscal policies have a role of making sure that decisions on resources are taken by including people's voices on those decisions. So a function of representation. And it is important to secure that economic discussions are available for the general public and people have voices to decide on those issues. And at the same time, we think that human rights must be a framework that is binding for states in order to design fiscal policies, because fiscal policy is subject to human rights principles and states must be held accountable in this regard. So that's clear according to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that says that each state party must undertake steps individually and through international cooperation to the maximum of its available resources with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights. So this has implications for the different phases of fiscal policies that are compiled here. This has implications in terms of resource mobilization. So states must guarantee or must secure that enough resources are mobilized to fulfill its normative obligations. But states also have the duty to make sure that the fiscal policy that they are designing is socially just, according to what the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has said about this. And similar obligations applied to the allocation phase of a fiscal policy and to the spending phase. So this is very important because it's not only a question of governmental discretion. It's not only a question of, okay, governments might comply with these obligations. Governments committed to do so when they ratified the human rights instruments such as the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And taking this into account, it's important to say that human rights might play a positive role in terms of designing better and responsible fiscal policies. So, in addition to provide a binding normative framework, human rights provide also an ecosystem of accountability mechanisms in which civil society can hold governments accountable by what they are doing on fiscal policy. One of those examples is the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Another function that human rights can play is providing monitoring tools to assess economic policies and particularly fiscal policies. So I'm going to explain in the next section what's the tool that we designed at the Center for Economic and Social Rights to do so. And finally, human rights can provide a unifying narrative to allow different sectors of society to claim their rights and claim specific things regarding fiscal policy. So before the distributive conflict and the distributive dispute for how resources should be allocated, there is a previous discussion, and it's what are the full amount of resources available to fulfill human rights. So instead of fighting over the distribution of the pie, it is important to fight among several sectors in collaborative ways for the size of the pie itself. So now we are going to see the tool that I was mentioning that in the Center of Economic and Social Rights we designed to assess the impact of economic policies from a human rights perspective. So there are some challenges that a tool like this must address. The first challenge is normative, and is how these obligations that we were talking about might be embedded and incorporated into the methodology that needs to be applied. There are political challenges, such as the limits that an assessment like this might have in terms of changing experts' discussion on the field. Because it is usual to recognize that economic policies do not have anything to do with normative discussions. But what we are trying to do is to amplify the focus of the methodologies to assess fiscal policies in order to design better evidence-based fiscal policies, and taking into account evidence and including expanding the kind of information that is used for assessing these policies is a way to encourage governments to take better decisions on this regard. So even when there is a political challenge to convince other actors that this approach is meaningful, it is important to insist on that, because it's not only a question of incorporating an approach that doesn't have anything to do with economic policy, but improving the way fiscal policies are designed for taking as long as they take into account these considerations. There are institutional challenges, and who might be able to conduct this kind of assessment, how to make it participative, how to make it meaningful for governments. And there are technical challenges. For example, how to prove causality between policies and outcomes, looking backward and looking forward. And of course, in times of constraints, there are practical challenges in terms of how to under genuine time crunch, how to carry out these assessments. So this is the publication that we have presenting the methodology. It's called Assessing Austerity, Monitoring the Human Rights Impacts of Fiscal Consolidation. This is a list of what are the rights that are affected under these episodes of fiscal consolidation, but we have discussed about that before, so I'm going to go directly to the methodological challenges of the question. And I want to explain a little bit this chart, because there are new methodologies, for example, fiscal incidence analysis, that allow researchers to incorporate the previous normative obligations that we saw. So this is a research conducted in the UK to assess the cumulative impact of tax of tax benefits and spending cuts by income decile of the population. So if you classify the population from the poorer segments of the population to the richest, how a combination of policies reduce or increase their disposable income. And this methodology, for example, the first chart, shows that the impacts on the lower deciles are higher of these measures in terms of reducing disposable income. And it is possible to calculate what are the specific policies that are contributing to those cumulative impacts. So this is what the first chart does. And what the second chart shows is that it is possible to distinguish how those measures impact on different segments of the population by race, gender, and other considerations. So, for example, in the case of this study from the UK conducted by the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the UK Women's Budget Group, it's shown that the poorest 33% of the population has been affected the most, and particularly Asian groups, Asian populations, by austerity measures in UK. So apparently it seems challenging to incorporate considerations such as non-discrimination, cumulative impacts in this analysis, but actually there are methodologies to do so. So the methodological challenges are not an excuse for not a valid excuse for not conducting this kind of assessments. In addition, it is important to take into account that according to human rights norms, austerity measures cannot entail retrogressive measures in terms of human rights enjoyment. So if certain level of protection of a specific right has been achieved, only a very strict justification of the measures taken can be admissible to accept retrogressions of rights enjoyment. And what's the criteria that governments must comply with to justify like those measures? Those measures must be temporary in effect and limited to the duration of the crisis, must be legitimate with the ultimate aim of protecting the totality of human rights, must be necessary in terms of showing that all alternative financing measures comprehensively examined and exhausted, are comprehensively examined and exhausted, must be reasonable. This means that the means chosen must be the most suitable means for achieving the goal of fiscal consolidation, and must be proportionate in terms of not affecting the minimum core of human rights, a minimum core defined by international human rights norms. So it is interesting to see how this discussion on the normative obligations is starting to reach audience like the IMF and like some regional economic commissions within the UN, for example, ICLAC in Latin America. So this criteria is starting to be taken into account in order to assess what are the alternatives that governments have in terms of economic crisis. And like incorporating considerations on this, it's important to try to work together with these institutions in order to design better measures. So the step that, the methodology that we propose is a 4 steps methodology that evaluates first of all, outcomes based on outcome indicators. So the main question here is from the perspective of rights holders, what is the problem? And if do fiscal consolidation measures have the legitimate aim of realizing people's human rights? Then, based on that consideration on outcome indicators, it is possible to assess policy efforts and try to connect those policy efforts with the outcomes achieved with the measures that have been taken. And there is a huge challenge there, but as I said before, to prove causality, there are methodologies that allow to show that the specific impact of each measure taken on the outcomes, that a country is having in terms of human rights enjoyment. Then the third step is how resource considerations affect those outcomes. And the final step is an assessment on, in light of the broader context, what are the responsibilities of governments and other institutions to try to change negative outcomes and how that can be done. I'm not going to get into details, but each of these steps have its own question, and we propose a set of quantitative and qualitative methodologies to conduct these assessments and answer each of these questions. So, in summary, this third step before going to the conclusions says that human rights impact assessment of economic reforms are necessary for trying to come up with better alternatives, are feasible for monitoring government's obligations, and are quite valuable for policymakers. And that has been recognized by the UN when the independent expert on debt and human rights issued a set of guiding principles on how to conduct these assessments. That happened last year, and that document is available for consultation in the UN system. So I want to finalize saying that the systematic way in which this paradigm of prioritizing cuts, budget cuts, and other contractive measures has been defended by several institutions, but now there are opportunities for change, and it is important to oppose this classical conception, or to oppose to this classical conception an alternative policy. And that's why, for example, Isabel Ortiz, Matthew Cummins, and some UN agencies like UNICEF are trying to do, proposing a UN consensus that take into account sustainable development goals seriously, to design fiscal policies more aligned with those goals. So if the renewed Washington consensus says that fiscal discipline and expenditure cuts must be prioritized, the UN consensus for development says that public economic and social investments for development need to be protected. And the main concern must be on how to expand government's fiscal space. And that requires to think in a more flexible way about deficits, for example. Because deficits are tools that governments might have in order to avoid larger economic impacts in the long term, using public spending as a way to stabilize the economic cycle, as a way to spend more in times of crisis in order to avoid avoid negative impacts on people's lives and on the economy as a whole. But the problem now is that, as we saw in the first examples, the first pictures that I show, the current approach is to try to cut expenditures and reduce deficits in moments in which the economy required to incur in fiscal deficits in order to avoid those longer-term effects. So the UN consensus says that taxation for development purpose must be prioritized with attention to needed redistribution, that regressive expenditures must be redirected, such as defense or subsidies to large corporations, that it is important to adopt more flexible macroeconomic planning tools to combine much better monetary and fiscal policies, and that there are other options available. So experience has shown that these options have worked in specific countries. This is a compilation of 8 alternatives to strengthen fiscal situations in a country that is going through a stormy time. So it is possible to reallocate public expenditures, and that has been done, for example, in Costa Rica, Iceland, South Africa, Thailand. It is important to increase tax revenues in progressive ways. It could be the fiscal space also can be strengthened by expanding social security contributions, by reducing, by curtailing illicit financial flows, and by adopting more accommodative macro frameworks. So this is only a compilation of potential measures that we have shown in specific cases that offset the need for austerity. So this is, to conclude, a chart from Brazil and Spain, which are countries that have adopted austerity measures recently, that shows that official estimates on the revenue that can be raised by tackling tax evasion or by eliminating tax expenditures offset the need for austerity, and actually can be enough for covering current deficits. So it's a question on how to make visible those alternatives to overcome a difficult political economic situation that leads to prioritize those alternatives that impact the most on the worst off. So, concluding remarks, human rights impacts of economic policies and fiscal austerity in particular are massive and usually ignored. But fiscal policy must be understood as a human rights issue, and those impacts need to be more visibilized by researchers in order to design evidence-based policies to address these impacts. Despite favored alternatives, austerity became the new normal, and it does not need to be this way. And human rights impact assessments of austerity are at once necessary, feasible, and actually quite valuable for discussing in a constructive way with policymakers other alternative policy solutions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sergio, for a detailed presentation on the interplay between human rights and their importance in designing policies. And I'm very happy that your presentation is in a lot of line with what we produce at APS. We believe that the social and economic conditions of people are basically a reflection of policies, particularly the ones that you have detailed today. The policies of austerities do immediately and directly and sustainably impact the livelihood of a lot of people and their access to basic human rights. We've seen the waves of demonstration across the world today, from far the West and Latin America, all the way going through Europe and the Middle East, all the way up to Asia. how they are a reflection of revolt against this paradigm of austerity and its impact on the access of millions to their basic human rights, either in their right to work, or in right to health, right to education. I really appreciate in your presentation how you established that fiscal responsibility does not go in contradiction with access to basic human rights. Unfortunately, I couldn't tilt my head a lot, but I'm very much interested in what you have developed as a methodology of assessment of the impact on of these policies. So without further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to do, in the very limited time available, is to do multiple rounds of 3 questions. Maybe 3 questions per round. So for the audience, you have a question, please identify yourself, and please jump immediately and directly to the question, so that we give more time for more questions for other people. أرجو من السادة الحضور بالنسبة للأسئلة أولا تعريف بحضراتكم، وأرجو أن المداخلة تكون مقتصرة فقط على السؤال، وأن السؤال يكون محدد عشان ندي فرصة أكتر لمجموعة أكبر من الأسئلة. وممكن الأسئلة تتسأل بالعربي، الأستاذ سيرجيو معاه الترجمة، فلو حضراتكم بتفضلوا أن السؤال يبقى مباشرة بالعربي هو هتتم الترجمة ليه. والزملاء هنا معاهم ميكروفون يدوا لحد يسأل. أستاذ اللي ورا.
السلام عليكم. هو سؤالي مباشرة.
عرف نفسك لو سمحت.
هل سراج رشدي.
أيوه.
هل سياسات التقشف التي غالبا ما يوصي بها صندوق النقد الدولي عبرت بالدول النامية إلى النمو الاقتصادي أم زادت من الكبوة؟ شكرا.
شكرا أستاذ سراج. السؤال الثاني كان في حد هنا.
My name is Tariq. I'm a journalist from Business Forward, the digital magazine of the AUC School of Business. My question is, I think you said that austerity measures have been found to sometimes exacerbate the issues that they're intended to solve, and that they can actually be damaging to the economy. So could you elaborate on that point, please?
On the damage to the economy. On the damage to the economy. في الأستاذ اللي ورا.
أنا اسمي مختار صلاح. هو عندي سؤالين تحديدا.
لحظة. أوكي. اتفضل أستاذ.
السؤال الأول، هو في دايما مقياس أنا مش فاهمه، ليه إحنا بنقارن العجز المالي أو البابليك ديفيسيت ليه بنقارنه بالجي دي بي؟ أنا فهمي البسيط إن البابليك ديفيسيت أو العجز المالي هو عجز خاص بمصاريف الحكومة عن إيراداتها، وأتمنى لو حضرتك تصلحوني لو أنا غلطان. الجي دي بي هو مقياس للجودز والسيرفيسز بروديوس، او الخدمات اللي انتجت، ممكن يكون ثرو بابليك سيكتور وثرو البرايفت سيكتور. فانا ماي سمبل اندرستاندينج ان احنا بنقارن فيجر خاص برقم عام خاص بالحكومه برقم وهو ليه علاقه بالحكومه والقطاع الخاص. فانا الحقيقه مش قادر افهم ليه دايما في كل المقاييس بنقارن نسبه البابليك ديفيسيت للجي دي بي. محتاج افهمها. الحاجه الثانيه، احنا مش بنتكلم دايما على الافكتفنس بتاع الميجرز نفسها بتاعه السبندنج. يعني ممكن يبقى البابليك سبندنج نفسه ineffective وبيزود زياده في العجز. فانا بيتهيألي قبل ما نبص للاستيرتي او ده فهمي، يعني محتاجين نيفاليويت الافكتفنس او كفاءه البابليك سبندنج نفسه، لانه ممكن يكون بال10 جنيه اللي انا بصرفها انا ممكن اصرفها بطريقه تانية تقلل within the same 10 جنيه تقلل الانفشنسي بتاعه المصروف ده، وبالتالي ممكن اصلا تساعد من غير ما اقللها انها تساعد في انها تقلل العجز.
شكرا. هنجاوب على الاسئله دي وبعدين هناخد نقط. So Sergio, the first question is from Mr. Sirag. Did austerity help or did it make it worse? generally speaking.
Yeah.
I'm going to reiterate on this question, if you may. Is it a general rule, or does it depend on cases? Does it depend on the time frame? Does it produce a positive effect in the short run, but a negative effect in the long run, or vice versa? Is it all bad, or there are cases where fiscal consolidation has turned out to have positive effect? And I'm going to also add to this question is, when do we draw the line between fiscal consolidation and austerity?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very important and challenging question. So, yeah, well, the research that has been produced by the IMF itself shows that fiscal consolidations have had a negative impact on inequality and economic growth in the short term. And more recently, research also shows that it might have had negative impacts on the long term. I am talking about the research done by the IMF itself, because there are several research made by other actors that show that those episodes of fiscal consolidation also have negative impacts in the long term.
Through which channel?
Which actors?
Through which channel? Through
because the fiscal multipliers that were estimated by the IMF initially were lower than other estimations available, other credible estimations available. So the capacity to increase the productive capacity of the economy is affected when governments reduce public investment, or key public investment for increasing economic growth in the long term. So that's
particularly the case in education. When public spending reduces spending on education, it reduces the productive capacity of the economy in the future.
Exactly. So I think that we are reaching a stage in the discussion in which even the IMF evidence is showing that new policies need to be considered. And that's something that was said several times by the former IMF director, Christine Lagarde. But the interesting thing in terms of policy discussions is how public spending, key public spending, can be protected, and the quality of spending must be strengthened instead of prioritizing automatically measures that reduce public spending. That has been the general approach until now. So your question is very important, because one of the alternative measures is to consider how to strengthen the quality of spending and to make that spending more efficient. The problem is that the classical approach to adopt measures in tumultuous times, like in economic crisis, is to assume that the problem is a high public spending. So that prevents us from having the right discussions. For example, how to reallocate expenditures that are not efficient, instead of focusing all our energies on how to cut public expenditures. And of course, there are methodologies available to track public expenditures and to assess its efficiency. I didn't get into details on that. In the publication, in the full publication, we compiled some of those methodologies to assess efficiency of public spending. And this has to do with the political economy of how those measures are adopted. And which actors have the stronger voice and the stronger capacity to decide on what measures must be taken. So if you have groups that have their own interest to keep some public spending as it is in areas that are inefficient, and those groups have the power to decide on the budget discussions on a yearly basis, it is very difficult to review those expenditures. So that's why participation, evidence-based policies, and accountability is so important for these discussions. So, tax expenditures, for example. Tax expenditures are those resources that states lose as a consequence of providing tax incentives to different sectors of the economy. The revenue potential of eliminating those expenditures is huge. However, why that doesn't happen? Not because we had evidence on the benefits of those tax expenditures. Actually, very few impact assessments of those expenditures are conducted to determine if those are efficient or not. So the discussion needs to be not in terms of like even ideological positions, but like the quality of the information available that we have for taking those decisions. This approach that we are championing here really values and gives the importance to evidence-based policies that taking fiscal decisions should have. It is important, for example, to advance towards establishing the duty to assess any tax expenditure that is granted to specific sectors. But the problem is that those tax expenditures are granted without any kind of assessment. So some countries have advanced to establish a legal duty to conduct assessments if tax expenditures are going to be extended in time on a yearly basis. That has been done, for example, in some Central American countries like Costa Rica, and that's a very interesting approach because those resources need to be assessed by the efficiency and the efficacy to achieve valuable social outcomes. And on your question on why to compare deficits with GDP and not with a measure of states' capacity or the available resources that states might have. I think that it has to do with the fact that it is important to assess how the deficit can be funded, taking into account the economic capacity as a whole. Because, of course, there are possibilities for governments to finance deficits even when they are not using their own assets or their own wealth. So that has become a proxy measure because it says how the economy as a whole can afford the current level of expenditures that a state is taking. But I think that this discussion is very important also to clarify that from a theoretical point of view, this idea of the possibility of expansive fiscal contraction has been challenged by a bulk of evidence available now from a theoretical and empirical point of view. So there is a researcher called Alesina, Alberto Alesina, who is the one that has defended this idea of the possibility of expansionary fiscal contractions. An idea that sounds sounds like against anti-evidence, counterintuitive, because it's. I want to do an analogy with like medicine, how to treat a person that is sick. If you instead of like feeding that person properly, you try to deprive this person from food and from the basic things that this person needs to get well soon. Of course, you are going to exacerbate the health problems that this person has. I think that works as well for an economy. But the argument of the need to reestablish confidence of investors in the economy has also been challenged by recent research, because this has to do with your question, the aims, how austerity can sometimes be undermine their own aims. There is evidence that in order to restore investors' confidence in the economy, it is important to restore first consumers' confidence and the dynamism of the economy itself. So if you are reducing wages, if you are taking off money from people's pockets with austerity measures, it is very difficult to have a sustainable recovery. And multipliers, economic multipliers, this is a measure to assess the impact of public spending on economic growth, show that that impact is higher when an economy is going through crisis. Public spending is more effective in periods of economic crisis than in periods of economic expansion. So it is very important to assess carefully the impacts of fiscal consolidation on reducing deficits in the long term. Because if you are negatively impacting economic growth, you are also reducing the potential of revenue collection in the future and the possibility to improve public finances. So that's why I was talking about the importance of assessing austerity on its own terms, and the evidence available shows that there are good reasons to think that austerity doesn't work, and economic contractive, expansive fiscal contractions are not working. And even Alberto Alesina, the champion of this approach, has recognized that he has made mistakes in its own research, and he is now like moving towards a different approach.
Thank you, Sergio. There's a question, the gentleman.
دكتور علي عسلية من فلسطين.
أهلا وسهلا.
التقشف بالمعنى أنه بكون نتيجة سياسة حكومة خاطئة أو عدم وضع استراتيجية للحكومة. الحلول التي طرحت تكون على حساب المواطن، فرض الضرائب على المواطن، تقليص الخدمات على المواطن، تخفيض الرواتب والأجور على المواطن. في وضع تطور علمي وتكنولوجي، هل هناك بدائل وحلول على ألا يتأثر المواطن بهذه الحلول؟ تكون المسؤولية على الدولة، على المؤسسات الدولية، على أساس أن المواطن ما يتأثرش بهذه الحلول. وشكرا.
شكرا دكتور علي. سؤال تاني.
أحمد النويشي.
فندم؟
أحمد النويشي.
أهلا يا أستاذ أحمد.
أهلا بحضرتك. هل هناك طريقة أو وسيلة للشعوب التي تم الضغط عليها بقوة حتى أنها كادت أن تلفظ أنفاسها الأخيرة غير الاحتجاجات أو التظاهرات؟ لأنه في قانون الرب معروف أن قطرة الدم بتبقى أغلى من الدنيا كلها، إنما في الحكومات بتبقى الشعوب كلها ممكن يتم التضحية بيها. تاني حاجة، هل الشعوب
سؤالك عن كان إيه؟ هل هناك غير
لو في وسائل، هل في وسائل بديلة غير الاحتجاجات أو التظاهرات في الفترة الأخيرة؟ طب السؤال الثاني، هل للشعوب يد في صنع قرار التقشف؟ يعني هل الشعوب أثرت في حاجة في يوم من الأيام مثلا بالبلدي؟ شكرا.
الأستاذ في أستاذ
Nagi Salama. I want to really thank you. I'm here. I want to really thank you for your lecture. My question is, as a suggestion of integrating a human rights approach into fiscal policy, it was the progressive policy, progressive taxation. So my question is, how can we incentivize the decision maker who has on top of his priority list to attract investments, knowing that we want to encourage progressive policy taxation?
Thank you. الزميل اللي ورا فندم
اسلام الخشني. انا بس كنت عايز اتكلم على الحاله بتاعت مصر. يعني انا واحد اتاثرت بالسياسات دي مثلا.
اتفضل عيد من اول.
انا عايز اتكلم على حاله مصر يعني واسال سؤالين كده. الاول بس انا من الناس اللي اتاثرت بالسياسات دي، واضطريت في اخر 3 سنين انا اشتغل شغلانتين، رغم ان انا مثلا موظف في البترول احسن مثلا من الموظفين اللي هم يعني
تمام
بياخدوا مرتبات كويسه.
سؤال حضرتك يا استاذ اسلام.
السؤال بقى، الدوله دلوقتي استسهلت عندنا، استسهلت يعني قلت الخدمات وشالت الدعم. دلوقتي لو انا جبت حتى عربيه جديده اشيل من عندي الدعم. الضرايب مفيش حد غيري بيدفع ضرايب. هل كان الدولة سهل عليها انها تعمل نظام ضريبي؟ دلوقتي مفيش اي شركة خالص او اي حد عنده محل او اي تجارة بيدفع ضريبة خالص في البلد دي. مفيش غير العمال، وحتى السلع ضريبة كده مضافة احنا برضو اللي بنشتريها برضو. فهل الدولة كان صعب انها تعمل نظام اللي يبقى كويس، يعني يبقى بديل شوية عجز الموازنة، بحيث انها مثلا ضرائب الارباح على البورصه لحد دلوقتي
واضح السؤال يا استاذ اسلام، واضح يا استاذ. في سؤال للاستاذ هنا.
الدكتور محمد وجدي، دكتور اقتصاد سياسي. في البدايه انا بشكر السيد سيرجيو تشابارو. كان ليا ملحوظتين انا عايز استيضاح عليهم. الاولى هي تاثير السياسات الضريبيه الملائمه كبديل لفكره التقشف.
تأثيرها على ايه يا استاذ؟
تأثير السياسات الضريبية
على ايه يا دكتور؟
على كبديل للتقشف حضرتك، يعني كبديل للتقشف. انا النهارده لو طبقت السياسات
تأثيرها على ايه؟ على الاقتصاد عموما ولا؟
على الاقتصاد عموما كبديل للتقشف.
اتفضل السؤال حضرتك الثاني.
الملاحظة الثانية هي رؤوس الأموال الفاسدة. يعني رؤوس الأموال الفاسدة هل هي برضو مسبب لعجز الميزان التجاري بتبقى في الدول؟ تعقيب حضرتك على ده.
رؤوس الاموال الفاسده
اللي هي مقصود بيها غسيل الاموال او اي نشاط اقتصادي غير مشروع.
تمام. تاثيرها
على النظام الاقتصادي ومن ثم عجز الميزان التجاري.
واضح. السؤال الاخير اتفضل حضرتك يا استاذ.
أحمد محمود، أنا عايز أقول يعني هل يمكن تطبيق ضرائب تصاعدية على اللي هم من تتجاوز دخولهم، يعني أو الشركات اللي هي بتتجاوز أرباحها؟ يعني هو إحنا النهاردة اللي ممكن يعني الملياردير بيدفع زي الموظف نفس النسبة، فهل ده يعني موجود في مثلا في أمريكا نفسها؟ بالإضافة لحاجة تانية، الاقتصاد الغير رسمي.
سؤال حضرتك كيفية تطبيق الضرائب التصاعدية يعني؟
وكيفية دمج الاقتصاد غير الرسمي. يعني للزميل لسه أشار إن دلوقتي في ناس بتعمل محلات وفي الشوارع على الأسفلت، ولا كهرباء بيدفعها ولا مية بيدفعها ولا ضرائب، وبيبيع بالأسعار اللي هي بيبيعها المحلات الكبرى والسوبر ماركت. طب ده ازاي يعني؟ ده في اي منطق ولا اي بلد؟
تمام، واضح السؤال يا فندم، شكرا. طب نجاوب على، احنا عندنا اسئله كتير قوي. لو في وقت هناخد في سؤال هنا عند الانسه، لا انا بفتكر بس عشان اللي بعديه، وسؤالين هنا. تمام. So Sergio, there are multiple questions. First, there are several questions on progressive taxation and how do we adopt them, what are their impact, and how, to what extent are they an alternative for austerity measures. So I just summarized the question. There are 1, 2, 3, almost 4 questions on progressive taxation. So how can they be applied? Can they be applied? Are they an alternative? And what is their impact on the economy in general? And there's another question on are there alternatives from the doctor from Palestine. And I think that the lecture has covered, and I really appreciate the table that you have shown, and we can, I believe you can make the presentation available if you can, and it shows really what are the policies that are generally adopted and what are the potential alternatives. There's a question also on the role of people and how can they have a say in these measures, and you've alluded to that through participatory approaches and so on and so forth. And a question on money laundering and the informal economy.
Well, thank you very much for your questions, all of them very relevant, and I think that, yeah, all of them pointed out to the issue of alternatives. So I would like to start with progressive taxation. I think this is a big discussion that is happening now everywhere. Research done by Tomás Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and other researchers based mostly in France and the US has shown how tax rates, effective tax rates for the richest segments of the population have decreased across the last 3 decades. A recent article written by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman shows that for the first time in the US, for example, the top 1% is paying less taxes, less effective, lower effective tax rates than any other segment of the population for the first time in US history. And in the US, the idea of progressive taxation is one of the assumptions that people have on the tax system. But the interesting thing is that public support for progressive taxation is increasing in the polls. For example, in the US, among voters of the Republican Party, there is a majority supporting higher tax rates for high-income people, for the richest sectors of the population. And I think that how to advance towards more progressive taxation has to do with that. Like how to increase political costs of not advancing towards more progressive tax systems. For Republicans in the US, for example, it's becoming more costly to not support proposals to increase the progressivity of the tax system. Because among their own stakeholders, they are facing pressure in order to do so. So I think that from a political economy point of view, that's very important. Increase the political costs for those who take the decisions of not advancing towards a more progressive tax system. But in contexts where those mechanisms do not operate in the same way that, for example, in the US, I think that it is important to improve the information that we have on what are the alternatives available. Because usually the argument to say that it's impossible to increase tax rates for corporations or high income sectors of the population is that it reduces the competitiveness of the tax system to attract investment. But what international evidence has shown is that the factors behind how corporations take decisions on where to allocate investment go beyond the tax rate that corporations must pay. Actually, the tax rate is a secondary consideration because there are more important things for investors. For example, infrastructure. Like, what are the costs of transporting something from rural areas to the main ports or to the main cities? That's a very important consideration for competitiveness. And it depends on the amount of resources available for the state to invest in those public goods. So I think that it is very important to improve the quality of the debate and the information available to show that for economic elites in the country and for opportunities of business, it's much better to have a strong and well-funded state to invest in key issues such as infrastructure than depriving a state from potential revenue by reducing effective tax rates to corporations and high-income people. That debate needs to be done, and that debate needs to be promoted among economic elites as well. And I think that what the economic crisis did in developed countries was to increase the concern for addressing tax avoidance. Because
which is the case in the informal economy in our country.
Exactly, and but that's not only happening in developing countries, but now after the economic crisis in 2008, also in developed countries, in the richest countries. Okay. So, for example, within the OECD, there is a discussion now about how to fix international tax rules in order to strengthen a state's capacity to increase revenue. Okay. Including fighting tax avoidance and evasion and combating illicit financial flows that studies have shown that deprive from more revenue than the inflows that developing countries received for international assistance, for aid and development. Okay. So that's a very important discussion.
Thank you. There was a question by the young lady here. Yes,
yes, I wanted to ask, austerity measures and ensuing demonstrations is something that has been going on since the 1970s. In your opinion, do you think governments have been improving in realizing that human rights should be is an issue that is within fiscal policies, or has it been getting worse?
Okay, excellent question. Yes, the gentleman here.
Yeah, Richard, I have a quick question, and going back a little bit to what Professor Atala said after the first round of questions on the distinction between fiscal consolidation and austerity. Because in many parts of the world, in Europe mainly, we introduced policies, for example, the 3% deficit spending, which limit our action as states. In Germany, we went even a little bit further and introduced into our constitution a principle that we are not allowed to make any new debts. The question is, since you introduced during your presentation, which parts of society are actually currently already affected by austerity, if you are aware of any studies which show which kind of investments into the future are affected by fiscal consolidation. Because my assumption is, and we discuss this currently in Germany, that especially investment into the future, digitalization, renewable energy transition, they are not undertaken because we have this fiscal constraints which we introduce into the constitution.
Thank you. Very valid question. The gentleman here.
First, my first question is how do you see the impact of the President Trump on the policies, economic policies on the world, recent world? Another thing, as my knowledge, that the president of the World Bank is usually American, and you can figure it if it's wrong. Is if the President Trump next year fall in the presidential elections, is the next president can change the have another changes and impact other impacts on
the young lady? Yeah.
I would, Jacqueline, my name. I would like to know how you propose to advocate for these human rights approach when it mainly serves those who have the quietest voice.
Very good, excellent question.
I think that since the 70s, the way economic policies are designed do not take into account human rights considerations. There has been improvements in some countries. For example, and at international level, some discussion about it. This idea of conducting human rights impact assessment is a concrete mechanism in which decision-making processes could be improved. And it is very interesting how countries like Iceland or Portugal adopted different approaches to austerity with very positive results as a consequence of assessing much better like the relevance and the suitability of austerity policies. So in some cases there has been progress.
But what actually there has been progress is the reaction of the people towards measure of austerity. And that has changed a lot in the past 3 decades. Towards being more vocal against austerity. I think that's changed considerably in the past 3 decades.
To being more
vocal against austerity.
I think that has changed over the last decade, and particularly now.
Yes.
Now there is a big popular backlash against austerity.
But it's also, maybe because I'm older than you, but it goes back also the post Asian crisis also. And actually, post the Asian crisis, there has been a lot of rethinking about these policies, even from the international institutions. But not yet, it didn't trickle down, I'm using the word trickle down, to the government level. Yes.
Yeah. But we are reaching a point where there is more openness to discuss the need of changing the paradigm.
Yes, of course.
So it's interesting that when there hasn't been like significant progress in general, we are reaching a point, a very interesting point in the discussion where another paradigm is needed. Regarding the question on what investments are cut first, I agree that those that have a lower political support and do not have a champion among the powerful actors are cut first. So, for example, green investments. But I would like to say something about green investments and transition to a new economy in terms of the energy sources.
A new Green Deal.
A new Green Deal. That's a very good expression to compile like this general idea of expanding public investment to advance towards a new energy towards new energy systems. I will say that fuel subsidies need to be dismantled progressively. This is very important because this popular backlash has started in several countries with the way governments get rid of those subsidies. And I think that those subsidies need to be dismantled. But the problem is how to do that, compensating first, like having compensation mechanisms in advance to dismantling those subsidies, and in ways that fiscal justice can be achieved at the same time that climate and environmental justice. That's an area that requires a lot of thinking, and but we need to advance towards that path. And the question on how to advocate for this human rights approach. Well, I think that actually the discussion, the international discussion, is incorporating more. It's incorporating this kind of approaches like SDGs, human rights, to reframe the way fiscal policies and tax policies are designed. So, for example, at the OECD, there are actors like the International Corporation for the Reform of Corporate Taxation, ICRIT, which are advocating for rethinking the way corporations are taxed using human rights obligations as an argument. And those discussions are very interesting because the way developed countries have been affected by this, by the economic crisis, is opening the door for them to be interested in fixing the problems of the current system that allow tax avoidance and illicit financial flows, for example. So there are windows of opportunity today to incorporate those considerations. But at local and national levels, I think that it is very important to work across movements and across different sectors of society. As I said before, more important, sometimes more important than the distributive conflict for how the budget is distributed among different priorities. It is there is a discussion on what are the resources available for fulfilling human rights and for funding budgets that needs to be undertaken on a cooperative basis, not fighting against each other among social sectors, but cooperating to defend how to mobilize more resources for funding social budgets in general. So, for example, in the region, in the Andean region, in Latin America, we are working at the Center for Economic and Social Rights with indigenous movements, with women's rights movements, with labor unions, in order to incorporate fiscal concerns into their own agendas. Like how indigenous peoples that was the movement that led the protest in Ecuador last week, might have a fiscal agenda, because these issues impacted them as well. Without resources, there are no rights without resources. So even for protecting indigenous people's rights, Afro-descendant populations' rights, it is very important to work with them to increase public awareness and public pressure towards more progressive fiscal policies. So we have to get out of our comfort zones and work with those that have been excluded from this discussion because have always heard that they don't have the technical tools and the capacity to address that discussion when they do, and when actually it is very important that we have those voices into the debate, but we have to work more with those that have been excluded from the official discussions on this.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you so much for a detailed and yet deep conversation about the impact of austerity measures. I think the key point, the key takeaway point for the audience today is that fiscal consolidation and human rights are not mutually exclusive. There is an alternative of set of policies whereby we can achieve both. Thank you so much. شكرا للحضور على وجودكم. أرجو أن أنتم توجهوا التحية للأستاذ سيرجيو على وجود النهارده. شكرا.